On March 28, 2014, as heavy rain cleared over the Brisbane River in Queensland, Australia, emergency services responded to a call from a quiet riverside park in South Brisbane. Beneath a rotunda near Kilpa Park, between the Go-Between Bridge and the William Jolly Bridge, a young woman had been found lying motionless on a bench. Newspapers had been placed over her body. A jacket partially covered her. At first glance, some passers-by believed she was simply asleep, perhaps homeless, sheltering from the storm. But when someone looked closer and pulled the paper back, it became immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. She was naked. She was severely injured. She had no pulse. Paramedics attempted to revive her, but she had already succumbed to her injuries. Detectives quickly secured the scene and began what would become one of Brisbane's most distressing homicide investigations in recent years. At that moment, police did not yet know her name. The victim was soon identified as 21-year-old French exchange student Sophie Colombet, who had been living in Brisbane while studying at Griffith University. Her identity was confirmed after her boyfriend in France recognized jewelry shown in a public appeal released by Queensland Police. What had initially been an unidentified tragedy was now a devastating loss for a family thousands of miles away. Sophie had arrived in Australia in February 2013 on a student visa. Originally from France, she had come to Brisbane to study business and to experience life abroad. Those who knew her described her as adventurous, intelligent, and full of curiosity about the world. She embraced challenges and opportunities with enthusiasm. Friends said she had a gentle, kind nature and a warm smile that rarely left her face. Like many international students, Sophie worked hard to support herself financially. She took on part-time jobs, including door-to-door sales and tutoring French. She had been saving money to return home to France in June 2014. Although she missed her family and her boyfriend Boris, whose visa had expired months earlier, she remained determined to complete her studies and make the most of her time in Australia. On March 16th, less than 2 weeks before her death, she emailed her mother affectionately, signing off with kisses. It would be the last communication her mother ever received from her. On the evening of March 27th, 2014, Sophie attended a night class at Griffith University. Classes concluded around 8:30 p.m. A classmate offered her a lift home, but she declined, choosing instead to take public transportation as she normally did. She boarded a bus with a friend and traveled to the Cultural Centre Terminal in South Brisbane. After getting off the bus, she said goodbye to her friend. That friend would be the last person known to see her alive. Carrying her umbrella and handbag in the rain, Sophie began walking toward her apartment on Key Street. CCTV cameras captured her near the river shortly before 9 p.m., walking along the Brisbane River. From that path, her apartment building would have been visible. She was close to home. Somewhere along that short stretch of riverbank, however, she encountered a man who would change everything. The man was later identified as Benjamin James Milward, a 25-year-old with a history of burglary and violent offenses. He had been released from prison months earlier. On the day of the attack, Milward had injected crystal methamphetamine and consumed large amounts of alcohol, including wine, beer, and bourbon. That evening, he was near the riverside rotunda where Sophie was walking. According to evidence later presented in court, the attack was sudden and brutal. Sophie was violently assaulted, raped, and repeatedly struck. The post-mortem examination revealed the extent of the injuries she endured: 128 external injuries, extensive bruising to her face, elbows, hands, feet, and spine, puncture wounds, skull fractures, and severe head trauma that caused hemorrhaging. Despite the severity of the assault, medical findings indicated that Sophie did not die immediately. She survived for several hours after the attack. During that time, she lay exposed beneath the rotunda as rain fell around her. Milward later told police that he panicked after the assault. He claimed he told her he would get help. Instead, he gathered her belongings and threw them into the Brisbane River. Her clothes, boots, handbag, and electronic devices were discarded in the water. He then fled the scene, leaving her critically injured and alone. As the storm moved through Brisbane in the early morning hours, the riverside area remained unusually quiet. When people passed by the rotunda, some assumed the young woman on the bench was asleep. The newspapers covering her body contributed to the mistaken impression that she was simply resting. No one immediately realized she was clinging to life. Eventually, someone approached and recognized the severity of the situation. Emergency services were called, but it was too late. Sophie was declared dead at the scene. Police quickly determined that the case was a homicide marked by extreme violence. Divers searched sections of the Brisbane River for her missing belongings. Investigators collected CCTV footage from surrounding businesses and public transport hubs. The search for a suspect began immediately. Attention soon turned to a nearby homeless hostel with a strict curfew policy. Officers discovered that one resident had not returned for several nights and had left his belongings behind. CCTV footage placed that same individual in the area around the time of the attack. His movements were tracked later that night boarding a train from South Brisbane Station at 11:23 p.m. He appeared agitated. The train terminated at Bowen Hills, where he was again seen on surveillance footage before heading toward Abbotsford Road. That man was Benjamin James Milward. In the days following the murder, Brisbane was shaken. The killing of an international student near a central riverside walkway caused widespread fear and anger. Vigils were organized, and flowers were placed at the park where Sophie had been found. Handwritten notes expressed sorrow and solidarity. Many who had never met her felt compelled to pay tribute. More than 60 police officers were assigned to the investigation. The case drew national and international attention. For Sophie's family in France, the devastation was immeasurable. What had begun as a promising chapter of education and adventure abroad had ended in unimaginable tragedy. As investigators worked tirelessly to locate Milward, the city waited for answers. The evidence was mounting, and the man who had fled Brisbane would soon be found. In the days following Sophie Colombette's murder, Brisbane was gripped by fear and sorrow. The idea that a young woman could be attacked so violently in a public riverside park sent shockwaves through the community. For international students in particular, the crime felt deeply personal. Sophie had been walking home from class, a routine, ordinary act, and yet her life had been taken within sight of her apartment building. While the city mourned, detectives intensified their search for Benjamin James Milward. CCTV footage had placed him near the scene, and his unexplained disappearance from a nearby hostel raised immediate suspicion. Patrols were increased across Brisbane, and Milward's image was released publicly. Authorities warned the public not to approach him and asked anyone with information to contact police. Milward had fled the area shortly after the attack. Surveillance footage captured him boarding a train at South Brisbane Station late on the night of March 27th. He traveled to Bowen Hills and then moved through various locations, eventually leaving Queensland. Investigators later determined that he had slept near Brisbane Airport before taking a train south. He traveled into New South Wales, registering with a job agency in Coffs Harbour. The manhunt stretched across state lines. Police followed leads methodically, tracing his movements through transport records and witness accounts. Less than 2 weeks after the murder, on April 7, 2014, officers located and arrested Milward. He was taken into custody without major incident and extradited back to Queensland to face charges. At the time of his arrest, Milward reportedly made statements indicating remorse. He told police that what he had done was horrible and claimed he had not intended for it to happen. He described himself as having a sexual addiction and said he had limited memory of the night due to drug use. However, investigators were not persuaded by claims of confusion or blackout. The forensic evidence was substantial. DNA recovered from beneath Sophie's fingernails was analyzed by forensic scientists. The results were conclusive. The genetic material was approximately 1.1 million times more likely to have come from Milward than from anyone else. The physical injuries documented during the post-mortem examination supported the reconstruction of a violent, sustained assault. During questioning, Milward admitted to sexually assaulting Sophie and striking her. He maintained that he did not carry a weapon, but acknowledged hitting her during the attack. He also admitted to disposing of her belongings in the Brisbane River. His claim that drugs had impaired his memory was challenged by witnesses who had used drugs with him that day, and stated that such substances did not erase awareness of one's actions. As prosecutors assembled the case, the weight of evidence continued to grow. Milward was formally charged with deprivation of liberty, armed robbery, rape, and murder. A committal hearing was held to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. Based on forensic findings, CCTV footage, witness testimony, and Milward's own admissions, the case was committed to the Supreme Court of Queensland. Meanwhile, Brisbane continued to mourn. More than 2,000 people marched through the city in a candlelight vigil honoring Sophie's life. University representatives spoke publicly about the importance of safety and solidarity. Flowers, letters, and handwritten tributes covered the area near Kilpa Park where she had been found. Messages expressed sorrow not only for Sophie but for her family, who remained in France facing unimaginable grief. Sophie's body was eventually repatriated to France. In her hometown, more than 1,200 people gathered for her funeral. Her parents, brothers, and boyfriend led the procession, carrying long-stemmed carnations. Members of a local musical group, in which Sophie had once played the flute, performed in her memory. The ceremony was marked by audible sobs and profound silence. 8 books of condolences were filled with messages of love and remembrance. Back in Australia, preparations for trial moved forward. However, before proceedings could fully unfold before a jury, Milward changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of Sophie Colombet. The plea spared her family the ordeal of a prolonged trial and the detailed public examination of evidence that would have accompanied it. During the sentencing hearing at the Supreme Court of Queensland, Sophie's family traveled from France to attend. Victim impact statements were read in court, describing the devastation that had reshaped their lives. They spoke of a daughter, sister, and partner whose energy and kindness had defined her existence. They described the day they learned of her death as the moment their world collapsed. Milward sat in the dock as the court heard the facts of the case. He offered an apology, stating he was sorry for what he had done. He had written a letter of apology to Sophie's family. The apology, however, brought little comfort. For her loved ones, no words could restore what had been taken. Supreme Court Justice Anne Lyons delivered sentencing remarks that were filmed for the first time in Queensland's history. She spoke directly to Milward, condemning his actions in unequivocal terms. She described the brutality of the attack and the abandonment that followed. She emphasized that Sophie had been a defenseless young woman walking home from university, and that Milward had shown her no dignity or respect. Milward was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, with a minimum non-parole period of 20 years. He received an additional 15-year sentence for rape, to be served concurrently. The court made clear that drug use did not excuse or mitigate the gravity of his actions. The sentence was intended to reflect society's condemnation and to ensure accountability for the harm inflicted. In the aftermath of sentencing, Brisbane's Lord Mayor met with Sophie's family to offer condolences. Community members continued to honor her memory. A permanent memorial was erected near the site of her death, featuring imagery meaningful to her family. Her brother later shared that a butterfly had landed on his hand days after her passing, a moment he interpreted as a sign of connection and comfort. A butterfly motif was included in the memorial as a symbol of remembrance. The case of Sophie Colombet became a stark reminder of the vulnerability many feel in public spaces and the unpredictable nature of violence. It also demonstrated the capacity of a community to unite in grief and support. Though Sophie had lived in Brisbane for only a year, the outpouring of compassion reflected how deeply her story resonated. For her family, however, the loss was permanent. They returned to France carrying not only her ashes, but the weight of a future that would never unfold. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, all would now be marked by absence. Sophie had come to Australia seeking education, adventure, and growth. Her life, described by those who loved her as full of energy and warmth, ended in an act of senseless brutality. Yet in the years since, her name has remained associated not only with tragedy, but with remembrance and calls for safer communities. The riverside path where she once walked remains part of Brisbane's daily life. People jog there, walk their dogs, and cross the bridges as they always have. But for many, that stretch of river carries a memory of a young woman whose journey ended far from home and of a community that vowed not to forget her.